in the number of players. You have an increase in the number of movements in a symphony. So we'll see the Berlioz example in a minute has 5 movements instead of the traditional 4 movements. And you'll see an expansion in the length, how long it takes for these works to be performed, and just the general scope. So you have that on one extreme, and then on the other extreme you have just the popularity of solo music, of solo piano music, and the the idea of the soloist within the context of a concerto becomes really, really popular. So you're kind of extending both ends of that. All right, this music is basically written for secular audience, middle-class audience, as compared to the music of the classical period, which was more of an aristocratic audience. The dynamics in the Romantic period have just a greater range of sound. So it's louder on that end and softer on the soft end. So, using 4 forte marks, for a dynamic indication for the big climax arrival points, and 4 Ps, and just having more description in the music from the composer to the performer. And then the idea of timbre, that Romantic composers continue to look for new sounds, so they're adding new instruments to the ensemble. And so one thing that we see with Berlioz is that he's using harps, he's using all these exotic instruments, and asking the performers to use new ways of playing the instruments. So we'll see that sponge-covered drumsticks in the first movement, or last movement, the colegno, the indication for the string players to tap with the stick of the bow. And so this creating more and more coloristic possibilities. And this idea of continual change is, that's something that we saw in the classical period, but that idea does continue in Romanticism. So here are some new instruments that are listed there: tuba, valve, brass, harp, piccolo, large orchestra. Piano was the dominant solo instrument of the 19th century. I've talked about the idea of this, virtuosity, and more things written into the music. And finally, this idea of emotional expression, that's the basic idea of what the Romantic composer is all about. All right, so this next composer that we're going to look at is, the first 2 is from France. Berlioz, Hector Berlioz. So Berlioz traveled to Paris because his parents wanted him to be a doctor. And he had no desire to be a doctor. But anyway, he went to Paris, and he then was really attracted to the musical scene. And one thing that I'll say about Paris is that it becomes the center for the avant-garde in the 1820s and 1830s. And so Vienna is always associated with a more conservative style of Haydn and Mozart. And Paris then becomes where all of the new things were happening, and kind of the center of the Romantic movement in Europe. So Berlioz had some experience from having gone to medical school for a while with anesthesia, with narcotics. And we're going to see that there are some autobiographical elements in this most famous of his works. Berlioz was someone who didn't have the kind of career where he could just make his money from writing music or performing his music. first thing is that he wasn't a performer on a traditional classical instrument. The only instrument he played was the guitar. But he had a great ear, tremendous genius for creating unique tone colors. And he was someone who actually made his living as a music critic of writing for newspapers. And so he had to spend a lot of time reviewing concerts, and he kind of resented that because it took him away from his composing. But he did make some money from conducting his music. And so, in a sense, he is one of the very first of this new breed of musicians, the conductor. And so that's something to remember about Berlioz. Also, he was really important for a treatise, for a book that he wrote on orchestration. And that was something that became widely studied and a big influence on that era. So with Berlioz, what we see is this idea of the programmatic symphony. And they were all big orchestral works that he's famous for. So his Requiem, which is music that is for the Mass for the dead, what is a really important work, Berlioz Requiem. And we're going to see that in the Symphonie Fantastique, the work that we're going to look at, that he uses one of the melodies from the Requiem Mass, which is called the Dies Irae, which is the liturgical sequence that has to do with the Judgment Day. And so that was a very well-known melody that represented death. And so Requiem Mass, then his 3 programmatic symphonies. So Symphonie Fantastique. Romeo and Juliet, so he was a huge Shakespeare fan. And then his work Harold in Italy, which was based on a work by Lord Byron. And that particular work, Harold in Italy, featured a viola soloist, which he wrote the work for Paganini, but Paganini rejected it because he said it wasn't virtuosic enough. And at the end of Paganini's life, then he took it back and said, I really made a mistake with that. I wish I hadn't declined to perform it. So that's what his fame rests on, are those works. And so this Symphonie Fantastique was premiered in 1830 in Paris. And it was extremely popular at his first performance. And in the audience were just all of these really important musicians, and that includes Franz Liszt, who actually was so taken by the work that he made his own solo piano transcription of the work and played it in his concerts throughout Europe, and actually helped to spread the fame of Berlioz through this transcription that he made of this work. So it's based on this program that he came up with. And if you look on the tab on the webpage that says theme sheet, and if you have that printed off, go ahead and pull that out. And you'll see toward the end of that packet the program of Symphonie Fantastique. So a couple of things that are autobiographical about this program. First of all, I've already mentioned the idea of his experience in medical school. And so this has to do with a young artist who is of an unhealthily sensitive nature and who, in a paroxysm of lovesick despair, because he can't have the love of this ideal woman that he's just gone, mad about, that he tries to commit suicide by taking opium and overdosing on opium. But he doesn't take enough, and it throws him into this series of drug-induced dreams in which everything in his mind is transformed into musical melodies. And so all of his feelings, and the beloved one herself, takes the form of a melody that he calls his fixed idea. So we'll put here also at this time, Berlioz has just really fallen for this Irish Shakespearean actress whose name is Harriet Smithson. And it has this autobiographical element about it. So it's like Berlioz is this young musician who's fallen in love with this woman, and it's unrequited, and so he's just tried to kill himself, and so he comes up with this story that he wrote this symphony for. So this fixed idea is associated with this specific work, and the fixed idea represents Harriet Smithson, represents his ideal love. And that she continually returns in each movement of the symphony in these different contexts. So that's the basic program. behind this great work. So that last sentence of the introduction in the program says, even the beloved one takes the form of melody in his mind, like a fixed idea which is ever returning and which he hears everywhere. And just as a side note, actually, Berlioz was so persistent that he was able to make contact with Harriet Smithson, and they did get married. It was a crazy thing. Neither one of them, he couldn't speak English and she couldn't speak French, but anyway, they got married, and then it didn't last but a couple of years as they both were so emotional, just completely fell apart. But it was the idea of, just having this, the sense of yearning for something, this ideal love, and yearning for that. That was the, the romantic, element that was appealing. All right, the first movement of the work is called Visions and Passions. And so it says, first he thinks of the uneasy and nervous condition of his mind, of somber longings, of depression and joyous elation without any recognizable cause. So that idea of something which is irrational, there's no recognizable cause, you don't know why things are happening. We'll see that at the end of the century, post-romanticism, the idea of just, the theories of Sigmund Freud, and the idea of these subconscious urges that drive human behavior, becomes really, really popular and important. It says, and he experienced these things before the beloved one had appeared to him. All of that represents the introduction. So in this first movement of Symphony Fantastique, and the movements that are on the listening are the first movement and the last movement, the first and fifth movements. But I'm going to ask you to describe, just generally write a sentence or so about what's happening in each movement of this symphony. Okay, so be able to give just an overall description of what the symphony program is about. But first movement is in sonata allegro form, and it's a very different approach to the form as compared to what we see with Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. The longest sections of the movement are the opening introduction. The other is the coda at the very end. So those sections, which are the optional sections of the movement, are really extended and used to create then the scene and to tell the story. So introduction is very long. The exposition then, it's in the key of C major, but the introduction is in C minor. So it has that same kind of function that we saw, with both the Prague Symphony and London Symphony. But this A theme in the exposition is the first presentation of the fixed idea that represents his love. And the way that you hear the theme presented, it takes a whole page to hear the theme. And so it's very irregular as far as the way that the phrasing is organized. The way that the theme begins is then the main thing that you'll hear coming back in later movements. So this thing's going to keep coming back in each movement. Because of that, then the overall symphony employs the cyclic technique that we saw with Beethoven in the Fifth Symphony with the Fate mode. And it goes even further. The idea of thematic transformation is a term that's used to describe this, not only return to the theme, but changing, the clothing of the theme, so to speak. So, it's just a process